Welcome to the 2022 VEX Robotics World Championship. My name is Grant Cox. I'm the chairman of the VEX Robotics Game Design Committee. And I'm here with Tyler McCrary, the VEX World Championship Master of Ceremonies.
Hi everyone. Grant and I are here in Dallas and can't wait for you to join us in just a few short days. We want to make sure that you can come prepared and get the most out of your VEX Worlds experience.
It's been a while since we've gathered for VEX Worlds. It's going to be the first time in Dallas for everyone, and we know that for many of you, it will actually be your first time ever attending VEX Worlds. So, instead of the typical on-site drivers meeting, we wanted to release this video ahead of time so that you have some time to absorb the information and prepare for the event.
That's right. We're going to talk about the event agenda, new contactless team check-in process, and some of the fun activities we have planned for the teams while there.
Of course, we'll also be covering inspection, going over some key rules, and answering some rules-related questions that you submitted in advance.
The first thing I want to make sure everyone knows about is the VEX Worlds app for Android and iOS phones. The app features a map of the venue, the VEX Worlds agenda, division assignments, and match schedules. Teams should also install the VEX Via app so they can check match results and rankings as they're happening.
So because we have all those apps, and all the information we need from teams can be entered online, that means we don't need to have an in-person team check-in this year. Instead, for the first time ever, we will be having an online team check-in.
Kind of like you would when you're checking in for a flight.
Exactly. So 36 to 48 hours before the event, all team contacts will be emailed a link to check in to VEX Worlds. That link will take them to a special page on robotevents.com where they will select the team they're checking in and answer a series of questions like how many students are you bringing, how many adults are you bringing, all those typical questions you would have been asked in an in-person check-in in years past.
Except now it's ahead of time so that you don't have to stand in line, right?
Right. Yeah. Plus, one of those questions will be signing up for an inspection time to try and avoid waiting in long lines for that as well. Teams will have a set of 30-minute inspection windows to select from. You'll sign up for a window that fits your schedule best, show up during that window, and get inspected with as little wait as possible.
So if I want to get there right when it opens, I can select the first window, get inspected first, and be one of the first on the practice field?
Totally. That's probably what I would do. But if you prefer to check into your hotel first, come a little later, have a little bit more of a relaxed schedule, you absolutely can select a later inspection time as well. And if you miss your time, there will be a standby line that you can wait in once all scheduled teams have been inspected.
On that note, is there anything new about the inspection process itself?
Yes. So here's how that will work. At everyone's pit, there will be a self-inspection form that the team has to fill out first before they come to inspection to cover some of the basic items. For those of you who attended LRT Worlds last year, it's kind of similar. When a team's pre-selected inspection time comes up, they'll bring that form with them to the inspection area, where the inspector will do a final check to make sure everything is legal.
All right. Is one of those going to be a firmware check?
Absolutely. As mentioned in the April 5th game manual update, VEX Worlds is going to be utilizing a new field control system that will not allow a team to play if they're on the wrong firmware. We've released a new firmware version, VEXOS 1.1.1, that all brains, motors, controllers, etc. need to be updated on, or you will not be allowed to play in your matches.
Get the firmware update, read the manual, check. What else is new this year?
Well, there's no round robin this year.
Whoa, what do you mean?
Well, the round robin is something we did back in the previous years, depending on the number of divisions that we had. This year, we actually have enough divisions so that we can play in a standard tournament bracket structure for the overall finals. VRC Middle School has 7 divisions, and VRC High School has 10 divisions. So, the winners from each division will be playing against each other in a standard elimination bracket, with play-in matches for the lower-seeded divisions, and the higher-seeded divisions will be getting a bye.
Okay, that makes sense. But typically, seeds are determined by qualification rankings. How are you going to be ranking the divisions in this bracket?
So that was also noted in the April 5th game manual update. So it's actually pretty simple. Divisions will be ranked based on who achieves the highest average score over the course of their qualification matches.
Obviously, the object of the game from match to match is to get a higher score than your opponent.
And so, it follows that each division should be trying to get a higher score than the other divisions to try and seed highest in the divisional rankings.
Wow, that is a big change, but I like it. What else you got?
Well, in addition to the firmware update, all Robot Skills Challenge matches will be required to use the Bluetooth radio mode on your radio and your controller, not the VEXNet. Again, see the game manual update, which has a link to a forum thread, which explains more about how this will be handled. Another new change is that all size checks during inspection will only be checked using the new expanded robot sizing tool. I know this season there were some Q&As, there was some confusion about using the old sizing tools versus the new ones. All sizes at Vex Worlds will be checked using the new expanded sizing tool. And the last one, I'll just cut off like half of the questions here. SG3 is not being changed for Vex Worlds in any way as far as what the head referees have to watch for. However, the enforcement period of SG3 is changing. It is no longer the last 30 seconds of the match. It will be the last 15 seconds of the match.
Well, you definitely hit some of them, but I have a whole list of questions here that were pre-submitted by teams who are ready to push this game to its limit. Are you ready for this?
I am. This is usually my favorite part of the in-person drivers meeting, so let's do it.
What happens when a robot from one team shoves another robot from the opposing team into a platform? How can a ref tell if it's an offensive strategy or if they're purposefully shoving the robot into the platform?
So there was like a dozen questions that asked basically the same question. The main Q&A that I'll point you to about this question is Q&A 1026-1026 that talked about this. Basically, when it comes to SG3, the most objective description we can provide is the very first sentence of the rule. During the last 15 seconds, robots may not contact the opposing alliance's platform. So, if a robot is contacting the opposing alliance's platform, regardless of how it got there, then a violation of SG3 has occurred. This means that if you're in a scuffle over a mobile goal that's near your opponent's platform and you accidentally get pushed into their platform or what have you, like, yes, that is still an SG3 violation. Yes, picking up an opponent from halfway across the field and dragging them across the field and shoving them into your own platform is going to be either a G1 or a G12 territory. I can't specify where that line is objectively, right? One of the Q&As along the season referenced the scenario where a robot was actually disabled. Can you pick them up and shove it into a platform? No, that's definitely going to be a G1 type scenario. That is not within the spirit of the competition. But if you're, like I said, if you're in a scuffle around their platform, you should probably make every effort to avoid touching it because it's probably going to be an SG3 call. As for that human judgment call type answer, I'm going to point to another statement that was made in a different Q&A, which basically says, hey, if you're choosing to rely on a human judgment call of an edge case rules interpretation in order to hinge your entire strategy around, you should be aware that you're taking a pretty big risk by doing so. It is well within the head referee's discretion to escalate any controversial or uncivil interaction to a G1 or a G12. I know some of you might have been looking for a more concrete black and white answer to that question. The only black and white thing about SG3 is that if you're contacting the platform, then it's probably a violation. Other than that, it's not combat robots. So that side's obvious. The gray area in between is where our human head refs are going to be making the judgment calls in matches.
If rings are shoved under the platform by the opposing alliance and it affects their parking, is there a penalty?
So this one is actually answered directly by SG3A and SG3D. If this occurs after the time break, which is 15 seconds at Worlds, the rule explicitly states that the rule is transitive through all scoring objects. So yes, rings count as scoring objects after 15 seconds. If it's prior to the last 15 seconds of the match, the rule explicitly states only mobile goals, not all scoring objects. So no, there's no penalty for ring actions prior to the last 15 seconds. Honestly, this is mainly so that refs don't have to like track every single ring around the field at every moment and figure out who put it where. So that's the main reason for that ruling there.
According to R10, a limited amount of plastic is allowed. If a team fails to provide proof of being able to fit into a 12 by 24 sheet, what will this result in?
So I know this question is asking specifically about the plastic sheet, but the answer is actually the same regardless of what inspection rule has been violated. This is covered by R3D and E. They state that a robot which has not passed inspection will not be permitted to play any matches until they have done so. R3E says that if a robot has passed inspection, but is later found to be in violation of a robot rule, they'll be disqualified from that match, and then they won't be permitted to play in any further matches until the violation is remedied and the team is re-inspected. So the natural follow-up to this plastic sheet question would be, what do we do if we think our opponent has violated the rule, right? As always, the number one thing is to just check in with your head referee. That'll be your first step of escalation for any concerns.
When a scoring element leaves the field in the last 30 seconds, for example, if it falls so that it's contacting the ground outside of the field, is it removed immediately or once the clock ticks to 0?
Yeah. So, of course, this is referencing rule SG9, which states that if objects leave the field in the last 15 seconds of the match for Vex Worlds, then they are not returned to the field. The question about if it left the field via contacting a wall or a floor or something was asked in Q&A number 888. And basically the answer there was, if it can be removed by a ref safely and in a timely manner, it will. But otherwise, if they can't, if there's a bunch of robots all up in there or whatnot, it will just simply be counted as not scored. I will also say at Vex Worlds, there are no walls near the fields. The fields are elevated, so there are no floors. So hopefully this scenario only comes into play if the object actually completely leaves the field.
Is it possible for the Blue Alliance to request a timeout and then for the Red to request a timeout, giving a timeout that is double the duration?
Yeah, for sure. There are no rules preventing this. Of course, every alliance gets one timeout during the eliminations run. And it's actually kind of a good sportsmanship, good ethical thing that we sometimes recommend, where if you see that your opponent is horribly damaged beyond repair and they need that extra couple minutes, you should, in fact, offer up your timeout coupon to them as well. So definitely no rules preventing that.
In Autonomous, if our robot and another robot reach the mobile goal at the same time, and the other robot pulls us over to their side, do we get a penalty for crossing into their zone?
Sure. So this question is referencing two rules. Rule SG4 would be the penalty if you if you crossed into the opponent's alliance home zone. But Rule SG5 does explicitly state if opposing robots contact one another while both engaging with the neutral zone and an incidental violation of SG4 occurs, then no penalty will be assessed on either alliance. This scenario you're talking about both robots coming in and looking for the same mobile goal, that's exactly the scenario that Rule SG5 was written for. So no violation.
Is it legal to set the opposing team's alliance mobile goal on the corner of the field wall?
I love this question. I would like to meet whoever asked this question. If you see me at Vex Worlds, come and say hi. So first off, good idea. Way to think outside the box as far as defensive strategy goes. Unfortunately, this is not going to be legal in practice. So Rule SG9, as we mentioned earlier, states that you can't intentionally remove game objects from the field. By placing the alliance mobile goal on the field wall, you are not technically violating SG9 because you have not technically removed it from the field. However, we're going to say that if a gust of wind blows on it, or if somebody jiggles the field wall or whatever, and it falls out, it only fell out because of your intentional placement there, and so we will call that a violation of SG9. If your opponent comes and tries to retrieve the mobile goal and that causes it to fall out, we're still going to call that a violation of SG9 via G14 because you were the one that caused them to be placed in that situation. You were the one that caused them to violate that rule. So cute idea, not technically illegal on its own, but as soon as that mobile goal falls out of the field, it's an SG9 on your part.
Are nylon screws acceptable alternatives to aluminum VEX screws for VRC?
So whether they are acceptable functional alternatives, I'll leave that up to the teams to decide. Legally, here's how non-aluminum screws and fasteners are going to be handled at Worlds. So this is obviously R12, which is the commodity hardware rule. And then this question was also sort of asked by Q&A number 895. R12 commodity hardware rule says you can use any screws, nuts, washers, etc. that you buy from the hardware store. We don't specify any specific material type. We don't specify color, all that fun stuff. There is a point at which, you're having to convince an inspector that this random thing you got off of McMaster is technically a screw. That's not within the confines of R12. If you're talking about pure just fasteners that are being replaced with a lighter weight alternative such as nylon, in general, the thought experiment that inspectors will use is if a screw could be replaced with a standard VEX screw and the functionality of the robot would not change, then it'll be legal. If you're taking advantage of this other material in some way that wouldn't be possible with a standard VEX screw, for example, if you're using nylon screws as flexible joints or things like that, that would be considered introducing additional functionality, and that would not be permitted. Again, simple thought experiment. If you could replace all the nylon screws on your robot with aluminum screws and it would still work the same, then it's probably legal.
If a robot is in the corner of the field in possession of a neutral mobile goal, can we safely grab the robot and pull him to our side, or even try to take away the neutral mobile goal? What if there's entanglement?
Yeah, this is a good question. So this is pretty explicitly answered by G12. I'm going to read it verbatim. Incidental damage that occurs due to interaction with a robot in possession of or hoarding a neutral mobile goal will, in most cases, not be considered a violation of G12. Tipping Point is intended to be a highly interactive game. With only 3 contested mobile goals on the field, we know, especially at this high level of play, that that's going to be the main focus of a lot of alliances. So in most cases, in almost all cases, this type of interaction that Tyler's asking me about is not going to be any violation. It's not combat robots. You can't pull out a giant hammer and start, destroying the other robot's electronics, right? But most standard robot-to-robot interaction, even maybe a little rougher than standard, is probably going to be fine.
The next few questions all relate to hoarding. Will hoarding for about 5 seconds result in a point loss? How long do you have to back off?
So for this question, I'm going to just read SG7 verbatim because you're asking some specific questions about 5 seconds or how long do you have, and it's kind of missing the point of SG7. Note, hoarding is not a time-based activity like a 5-second count like trapping. As soon as a robot is observed by the head referee to be actively blocking an opponent's access to more than one mobile goal without possessing it, they will at a minimum receive a warning. So the time in which you are hoarding it, the amount of time since you have backed off, all that stuff is irrelevant. As soon as you are hoarding, even instantaneously, that's a warning. The determination as to whether it escalates to disqualification or not will then follow the standard match-affecting calculus that head referees typically do, right? So yeah, if you're instantaneously holding a couple mobile goals for just a second, but then the opponent gets them back later in the match or whatever, that's probably not going to be a disqualification, but it will be a warning.
To be hoarding a mobile goal, does the robot have to completely restrict the access to the mobile goal, or is it still hoarding if it slightly blocks the access to the goal, but leaves a sufficient gap for the other alliance to retrieve the mobile goal?
This question is getting into the weeds on the definition of hoarding and SG7. I'm just going to read one portion of the definition of hoarding verbatim. A robot is considered to be hoarding a mobile goal if it is actively blocking an opposing robot's access to a mobile goal without directly possessing it, such as by expanding horizontally across a portion of the field. So the operative thing that referees are going to be looking for is whether you are actively blocking access to the goal or not. And so I guess my reason for saying that is this specific scenario you're describing of, there's kind of a block, but then there's also kind of like an access path on the side or whatnot. Like, this is all very context dependent. It's very extremely dependent on the context of the match, and if there have been any warnings prior, if the opponent was actively trying to get it, or if you're just kind of sitting there passively. I can't provide an objective, absolute answer to this one. It's really going to just depend on in-match strategy.
Looking at SG7 and SG10, would it be legal to hoard goals using scoring elements, like using rings that either start on the field or match loads to build a moat?
Good question. Texas State Champs, I see you. So again, we're obviously SG7, SG10, you asked it in the question. The red box in SG7 does state actively blocking as one of the criteria to denote hoarding or not. So the GDC has determined that this would be more considered passive blocking, and therefore not a hoarding violation in itself. This also should help head referees from having to watch, did the rings just get there by accident, or did the robot come and drop them off themselves? Rings are a part of the field terrain, as it were, and robots should be expected to be able to drive around or through them. So no, provided that no other rules are violated, there are no rules preventing this.
So we have another ring question that's not related to hoarding. Can match load rings be placed in such a way that they're stacked horizontally, leaning against the wall?
Yeah, so this question had a much longer explanation, but I think I understand what they were asking. Basically, if following SG8 and all of the caveats within SG8, if you're legally introducing match load rings and lining them up against the field wall in this kind of like horizontal stack, I don't believe anything is wrong with that. They're all contacting a field tile. They're not in a scored position, and there's nothing that states they can't be contacting other rings. So yeah, that should be fine.
Even if platforms aren't completely level, like drooping a little due to double parks, are they still balanced?
Yeah, so for this one, you just go right to the definition of balanced. The two most pertinent points are, one, the platform must be roughly parallel to the field. The word roughly is very intentionally included. And point two, both flat surfaces of the platform hinges are contacting the platform base, as shown in figure 7. If you look at figure 7, there's a very clear moment where the platform hinge is either contacting the base or you can see daylight underneath it. So regardless of what is happening with the polycarb over here, as long as those hinges are touching and it's roughly parallel, then yeah, that should be considered balanced.
Would it be legal for both teams on an alliance to start on the same side of the platform, given that they're not touching each other?
Yeah, this is a pretty straightforward SG1 rule. Just read through the criteria on SG1. Basically, there is no criteria preventing this. So as long as they're not touching each other and they're not doing anything else that's made illegal by SG1, yeah, that should be fine.
All right. Well, that's about all the rules questions we have time for.
Cool. you said in the beginning, Tyler, that there's a lot of other things that teams can do during the competition.
That's right. Teams should definitely check out all the ceremonies that are happening in the Dome. The opening ceremonies will have amazing lights and music and have lots of awards that'll be given out. And the closing ceremonies are where we'll play the overall finals, give away the top awards, and have the game unveiling. But between those ceremonies, we have prizes for pit decorations, costume contests, along with a bunch of really fun exhibits to go visit.
Yep, don't miss the exhibitors. I hear you can always get a bunch of swag from those exhibitors.
So, what if someone gets lost, doesn't know where to go, what to do, has questions about the app or the online team check-in? Where can they go for help?
Help is always found at Pit Admin. Pit Admin is your one-stop shop to get any answers. This is also where teams will go to pick up their medals and pins.
Right, no team check-in, so no bags to pick up or things to fill out when they get there.
That's right. Online team check-in, teams will be doing that before they arrive, and if they forget or can't figure out how, they can always get help at Pit Admin.
Well, this was fun. I hope it was just as informative for the teams as it was for me.
Tyler, just wait until you see this event. I look forward to it every year, and this one has been a long time coming.
Thanks for watching, and be sure to say hello to Grant and me when you see us at the 2022 VEX World Championship. See you there.